welcome back to another episode of Thinking That Matters. I am here with my colleague and very dear friend, Peter Varberg, and I am so thrilled to be able to interview him in the Porto, Portugal airport. We have just completed a week of amazingness here for an incentive trip that we earned. So I'm looking forward to you learning more about him and how he values thinking that matters. So Peter, give them the 30, 60-second commercial, who you are, where you live, what you do.
My name's Peter Varberg. I live in San Diego, California. I work as a coach, so I help people reach their goals. And I was born and raised in the Philippines, so I have a little bit different of a background.
Yes, I mean, thinking of your background, how many years were you in the Philippines before you came back to the States?
Simple way to look at it. Birth through college.
Okay.
I came to America for college, but every 4 years we'd come to the States for about a year and we'd go to a school. So it was just like my parents got to visit churches that supported them. So I wasn't completely separated from
the States. Now,
the States.
For the viewing audience, they probably need some context. So what were your parents doing and why were you in the Philippines to begin with?
Yes. So my parents were serving a specific people group on the island of Leyte, but they started church, started a school, a big ministry for college students, so they were missionaries out there.
Awesome. And what would you say was one of the biggest learning lessons for you living so much in a foreign country?
Well, the world's a lot bigger than America.
That's a good lesson to learn.
I think just realizing the scope of problems. I think if you're speaking about our thoughts especially, it's different when you look at the challenges that people have to deal with on a regular basis versus the challenges that tend to consume my thoughts living in San Diego versus what I grew up with. And just that perspective shift of realizing that the problems, the joke is they're first world problems.
Yes.
But knowing that very well from an early age, I think dealing with my plans not going the way I planned or things going wrong, it's a very common occurrence for anyone who's spent a lot of time in a developing country, that flights, travel, roads. We had a Christmas vacation once where the night before our trip, there was a typhoon and rain.
Wow.
And we got stuck behind a landslide for 10 and a half hours. So we just sat in our car, couldn't go anywhere. So it's just like things that change that you have no control over.
Wow.
That you just have to deal with. That happens a lot. So learning that at an early age and just...
So how did your parents equip you to deal with some of these problems that were out of your control in the Philippines?
Yeah. I mean, I think we just had to learn how to have fun with it. So even typhoons that could be considered, hurricanes, a bad thing. For us, it was like a water park in our backyard. We just went outside. Streets would flood and you'd see kids with like skimboards out there. So it's just like, I think one of the things that was helpful as well was that the culture in the Philippines, they're very happy people, very contented people. So there was a lot I learned from just seeing how locals handled issues. But I think both my parents had grown up as missionary kids as well.
Okay.
So just part of who they were. I think, for example, I've always heard, and I don't have kids yet, but when a kid breaks something or they fall, they will look at their parent to see, was that bad? Should I cry? And if the parent freaks out, then they freak out. And if the parent thinks, oh, that's normal, then it's not a big deal. So seeing my parents in these situations and their response that, oh, these things are normal, life goes on, trained me early on.
Yeah, that's a great point, this idea of mirroring, right?
Yeah.
children will mirror the response of the parent. And because whether we like it or not, we learn so much, who we become is so much from observing the people who are in authority over us.
So their calm spirit, just, oh, well, we're going to sit here for a bit, have fun, kids. Like in the landslide, we set up soda cans and we shot our little airsoft guns out the window, and we just found ways to entertain ourselves.
To pass the time. Okay. Because one thing that you said, I wrote reframing problems.
Yeah.
So when you think about reframing problems, fast forward into your adult life, you're through college, but you kind of had an interesting job during college. Tell my listeners about that.
So I sold books door to door. And it was interesting for me in my experience because my dad had done it through college. So from an early age, I'd get these stories about his experience. And a lot of, parents being missionaries, for those that don't really understand that, my parents in American standards were kind of below the poverty line income level. But living overseas, that was plenty for our needs.
Got it.
But their income was always in relation to our need.
Okay.
So there was never extra, basically. But my dad always had these ingrained principles where he was very good. He had these success principles. We took a trip through Europe when I was in high school with money he had saved in college. He was very good with his money. So I'd always seen these signs of my dad had this effective training. So although as a kid I was rather shy, due to the fact that I stood out in the Philippines, blonde hair, blue-eyed, I didn't like the fact that people noticed me. So I was doing everything, very self-conscious, doing everything I could to hide because just who I was stood out. So that made me a very shy kid. So then thinking of going door to door, talking to people all day sounded horrific. But seeing my dad and the way he had these sort of success principles ingrained to him was what caused me to say yes. So even in that, my very decision to do that was basically, this scares me, but I don't want to live the rest of my life ruled by this fear. So I'm going to do this as a 17-year-old between my junior and senior year of high school when everyone else is college kids, because I want to grow.
So you started selling books when you were 17?
Yeah. So we had, my junior year was one of the years that we were in America.
So you could, because you were already there.
So I basically, and it's a big part of, I think, when you're talking about things I've had to overcome, I had a tough journey comparison-wise, because both my father and my brother did really well. And then I started earlier than anyone else. And my summer was about half the length of a normal summer.
Okay.
So mentally, the mistake I made is I compared my summer as a high school kid to all these other college peers. Some of them, after their senior year of college, was their first summer. But to me, since it was our first summer, we were equals. And they sold for 12 weeks and I sold for 7. And I took my total sales and compared it to them. So out of my 8 summers, the first 5, I saw myself as a failure because I never did, comparison-wise. That was, comparison's a thief of joy. And
it is. And so what did you do to really overcome this comparison trap, as we like to call it? I mean, what specifically did you do or think or say to yourself to help break out of this comparison trap?
Well, there are 2 things. One, I think I had a leader, a sales manager, who actually walked me through logically, where it was like, that was the age you were. You shouldn't have treated that as your first summer. Your second summer should. So it's just like, oftentimes, even if I look at some individual that might pass in the airport, and based on what they're wearing, what they have, I'm like, man, I want that comparison, that envy. But you're not it's not the full equation. I don't want all of their life.
Because there are likely things there that you don't want, for sure.
So a lot of times when you're dealing with that, when you actually look at it factually with truth, I think that's one way that you can deal with, because I think at its core, whenever we're wrestling with that, usually it's based on a lie. So if you actually think about it, oftentimes you'll find that the facts and the logic, we're thinking emotionally, and the logical part of our brain is turned off, and we're just going down this rabbit hole of doom and gloom and frustration. And
so this leader helped you walk through it logically. You said there were two things. What was the second thing?
The second was, I remember my 5th summer, and every week we'd have this Sunday meeting where we all get together and we celebrate our weeks and there's recognition. I had never gone to one of those feeling proud of my week. I either had my best week ever, and I would think, it's about time, you should have done that last year. That was my automatic response, was some reason why I was behind, or I'd failed, or I should have done better. And then when I had a terrible week, it was almost like providing evidence to the story I was already telling about myself.
It's a continuous loop. Yeah, it's a very vicious cycle when we're in that.
So I don't remember exactly how he said it, but it was more of just choosing to be proud of the work that I'd done. I think there's a general theme, if you've spent any time around Southwestern and the company we work for, of changing from a results-focused mindset to an activity or an effort or an attitude focus, where I could celebrate the work I had done regardless of the outcome.
Yeah.
I think that's a general principle through life in general. And even with the examples of growing up in the Philippines, the outcomes were always out of my control. But if I focused on the process, I had a lot of fun waiting 10 and a half hours for this landslide to get cleared, because what else am I going to do? Versus obsessing about when is someone going to clear this road and the outcomes of the situation. Yeah,
that's actually I'll have to make that a pick your path topic.
Yeah.
Out of control versus focus on the process. Because
it's really your path, because I get to choose my perspective on life. And if I have two choices of, you can focus on this and you're continually going to be out of control and it's never going to go the way you want, and it's just going to lead to suffering and frustration continually. Or I can choose to focus on this, where I have a surprising amount of control about my personal attitude, my level of enjoyment of a situation. And it's just a very different life.
Yeah, so I want to review what Peter was saying, that this leader that spoke into you, and that reminds me that who are you leading and how are you leading them? Because that makes a difference in the impact, the influence that you are having in the lives of the people that you are leading. Because this leader, one, helps you to understand from a logical standpoint, the factual, the truth. So I might think of that as, no matter what you're doing, where you are, you're asking yourself, what are the facts? What is true here? What is a lie? And really identifying where things fall in that sense. And then the second thing was really focusing on activity over results, because you were in this vicious cycle of comparison, and not just comparison to other people, but you were even comparing to your own self.
Yeah.
And finding ways to think less of what you actually had accomplished, which I find interesting, because I wonder how many people really, they start with comparing themselves to other people, but then they get stuck in their own internal vicious cycle of self-comparison and always finding themselves lacking. Is that making sense?
Yeah, and part of it is the fact that both my dad and brother had done this job before me and had done really well. So there was a level of expectation that was like, oh, this is what I'm expected to do because of my family. But then an internal set of beliefs and insecurities that were much lower than the expectation. I think a lot of people live their life like this, where based on what they think they should be or where they think they should be at, because there's this social media image crafting and we're looking at our peers and we think we should be here, and then we have an internal belief about ourselves that we don't think we're capable of that. So you're just starting with an equation that has
a big gap.
A gap of disappointment and frustration. And there's really, until you rectify the formula, your brain is going to look at life with a negative lens.
Yes. So for you, beyond this leader really getting you to think factually and then also focusing on activity, what other ways did you help to narrow the gap between the limiting belief and the expectation that you held? How did you narrow that gap?
Well, I think part of it, until there's enough pain in your current situation, you're not going to change. And I had suffered for 5 years feeling like a total loser and failure. So I think finally realizing that this sucks and I don't want to live this way anymore just motivated me to problem solve. I think just the way our mind works, we'll sit in emotions and until we put words to it, like our brain has the capacity to solve our problems. And until we decide that we're ready to solve them, we're just going to sit in the emotion and the pity party. And once I realized this is terrible, let me do something about this, my brain started acting. And I don't know and it was really a long time. I don't think I ever really saw myself as a quote-unquote top producer until I came here. Because the reality was I was being interviewed to come to this job. And I just remember feeling so, like batting out of my league. And Dave and Emmy Brown were interviewing me, and I'd heard legends of what they'd accomplished.
On the book field.
I remember the interview question about talking through my results from selling, and I was almost like, oh no, once they find out the truth, they're not going to want to hire me.
Okay.
And then I had a relatively decent start here. And after that, it was fascinating to actually start shifting the story. So it's I think some of it is when you find something that you actually can get convicted about being good at. So you don't have to, sometimes we're beating our head against the wall, trying to be something that we're not. And then I think coming here, my level of conviction of coaching actually allowed me to succeed at this job. So I'd found something that I could create some evidence, because oftentimes confidence is only false confidence until you can actually put something behind it.
Yeah,
and this job gave me something that I could
put behind it. So I think that's interesting. I think for the listening and viewing audience to think about, there were so many pieces of gold there. Specifically, until the pain in our current situation is enough to move us to want to problem solve it. I think there's that. Secondly, you talked about that we can sit in emotion and just kind of hang out there. And in a sense, that's that wallowing. My dad used to call it when you're just wallowing in it. And it's being willing to step out of that. But for you, I think that's a great connection of finding something where we can have true conviction. And that conviction fuels our confidence. And then our confidence then allows us to really continue to grow and see ourselves differently. That's I love that. What were we going to say?
Well, the thing I would say is that, my story I don't think is the best example, because I waited for something within the sphere of my career that I could build success on and confidence on, but you don't technically have to wait years like I did. I think just the truth of the Bible is building your identity on something outside of what you've done and who you are. So wherever you are in life, you can choose that perspective and build confidence on a firm foundation. And then there's other aspects of life. But I was choosing to build my self-worth and self-esteem on my career and my success. And in that previous job, I had a faulty formula where I was a failure. So that carried over pervasively into all of my life. And I unfortunately waited years until I got to a career that I could find conviction. But you don't have to follow my example and suffer as long as I did, because there's things in your current situation that you can choose to find confidence in that doesn't have to be.
And what's interesting in my research, that courage precedes confidence. So when we act in courage, neurotransmitters start firing, and we begin to anchor certain things in our mind, and then so we courageously take a step and we look back to build confidence, to see what we did. We call them confidence anchors in Southwestern Consulting, because we acted in courage, for example, to then experience those confidence, what becomes confidence anchors. So I appreciate you talking about you don't have to wait to do that. Now, before we begin to wrap up, I feel like it would be important. I have a variety of listeners and watchers of the podcast, but you did mention that, really basing things on the foundation of faith. How has faith helped you in your journey? What would be, maybe even one or two aspects where your faith has been an important part of your development, both personally and professionally?
Well, I feel the very foundation, you look at, and some people have done the research of all the different world religions, and you look at Christianity and the Bible and this concept of grace and being, the whole point is that it's not about me and that I am not enough in and of myself. So when the very belief system the lens that I'm choosing to see the world through is a story about someone who is enough, loved me enough to do what I could never do for myself, that shifts a lot of from my examples I've shared, was very wrong about my life, which I don't think is unique to me. I think a lot of people have made the similar mistakes psychologically. And the fact that the very essence and foundation of what the Bible talks about is that that's okay, and you're human, and you're never going to be enough. And instead of that pointing me to shame and frustration and hopelessness, it's pointing to the need for a Savior. And the more I get to know that Savior, that confidence comes from realizing that I am never going to be enough, but this person that I have a relationship with is more than enough, well exceedingly more than enough. So I don't have to have confidence in myself. I've had confidence in someone who's enough, and then that overflows. And that's a daily choice. So I'm not always living that out, but I have access to that. Right. And that's how it's impacted my life. When I choose in that day to see my life from that perspective, nothing can really go wrong. Because our problems are in proportion to our perspective. If I get a flat tire today and I'm just trying to get to work, that's a big deal. But in the scope of a year,
it's not
small
a big deal.
Problem.
Yeah.
So I have a scope of eternity to look at, and my problems are minuscule if I choose that perspective. But if I'm late for a flight and I'm, behind on a competition for work, and I choose that perspective, it's pretty defeating.
Oh, it is. That's such a great, I love that you bring that up. Oftentimes I say in the scope of the kingdom calendar, it is just a blip, right? Blip. So I think it does add such a valuable perspective where that's concerned. Well, Peter, wrap us up. I ask all of my guests, why do you believe it's important to cultivate thinking that matters?
I mean, it's really, circumstances are always going to be out of our control. And our thinking frees us from a life that is ruled by other people and other things. I mean, living in America, it's tough to imagine, but if you were in Ukraine right now, you have no freedoms around things that I have always taken for granted my entire life. So how does someone in that situation or someone in Haiti have hope? There's no other way to overcome truly hopeless situations than your thinking.
Love that.
And you don't have to be truly hopeless to take advantage of that.
Right.
You could just be, not making as much money as your neighbor, and I've also seen that going door to door, it's like a giant sociological experiment.
Yes.
And I've seen that regardless of how good someone's circumstances are, you will find a way, if your thinking is wrong, to suffer.
Wow.
And the difference between going door to door in America and seeing 3-car garages, boats in the back, and people suffering from addictions and depression, and then going to a developing country where they have a physical depravity, but they're full of joy, shows you that there's something other than the money, the fame, the fortune, the circumstances that we can't control that determines someone's quality of life. So your thinking really...
I love how you
it.
said that thinking that matters gives us freedom.
Yeah.
That's an excellent way to wrap up this particular episode. I always share that it's so important to cultivate thinking that matters, because when you cultivate thinking that matters, you cultivate a life and a business and a mindset that truly matters. And what Peter has added to this conversation is when you cultivate thinking that matters, you also cultivate a perspective on freedom that truly can allow you to live life filled with joy and with hope.